Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from whichever part of the world you may be joining us. It is a pleasure for me to have this speaker of today because I am really excited for the presentation she has prepared to us. And the song you were listening to is one of her favorites, and she just dropped the name of the song there in the chat for you guys. So, welcome everyone, and let's get things started. For those of you who may be new to this community, the Mining API community is your go-to space for all of you practitioners and enthusiasts on all things APIs and integration, specifically for the technologies of Google Cloud, Apigee, and application integration. We welcome all of you to this space of yours. The simple rules of these bi-weekly or weekly sessions, depending on whatever time allows. We're also going to have a presentation to all of you from a Google Cloud expert. And at the end, we can have a Q&A respectively to the topic that was presented. Or if you'd like to bring a different topic to the table, you're more than welcome to do so. We're going to meet almost every Thursday if time allows. This session is being recorded, and we're going to share it through the Google Cloud community. Now, our Google Developer Program forms a space for you. And I always like to make this shout out to everyone from the community. If you like to be in this stage and present your knowledge to the community, you're more than welcome. Feel free to reach out to me via the community or LinkedIn, and I'll be happy to allocate some time for you to present in this scenario. With that, let's keep our questions towards the end, but you can start sharing wherever comments or queries you have for Sophia in the chat. Or if you like to use the Q&A feature, you just have to go to the 9 figures on your right below corner in Google Meet and share your questions in there. And we'll go through those at the end. With that, I'm really happy to present with you Sophia Almeida. She is our Customer Success Manager at Google Cloud, specifically for Apigee and for application integration. She is based in Portugal, and today we have the pleasure for her to present production partners exporting Apigee logs to BigQuery and Google Cloud Services for analysis. Welcome, Sophia. Take it over, and thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you, Alex, for the introduction. By the way, I don't seem to have permission to share my screen.
Let me handle that.
You can provide that. And then thanks to everyone for joining today. As Alex just mentioned, we'll be discussing a production pattern, namely how to export Apigee logs. So in this case, Apigee Analytics and Proxy custom logs, and then to the destinations, which can be Google Cloud Storage in this case, and BigQuery. Those are the two ones we'll be covering today. I will just quickly share my screen. And let's dive in. I believe it should be visible now. Yeah. So as I mentioned, this is the main topic for today's discussion. On our agenda, we have the two processes I just mentioned. So we're going to be covering how we can export all this nice information that Apigee Analytics already contains in our Apigee component about our proxies. We're going to learn how we can export this information to BigQuery and Google Cloud Storage. And then on the second point of our agenda, we'll be learning how we can, if we have a custom logging strategy already implemented, for example, in our proxies, in that case, we're going to see how we can export this information to BigQuery as well and to Cloud Storage. Here, there are a few more possibilities, but in this specific presentation, we'll be covering specifically BigQuery and Cloud Storage. Then we'll see a quick demo about these two approaches and how you can implement them on your side. And finally, at the end of this presentation, we're going to make available some assets and some very useful links. If you want to deep dive more on the topic, you can check those out and maybe develop your own solutions based on these two approaches we'll be covering today. So starting with how we can export Apigee Analytics data to BigQuery and Google Cloud Storage. First of all, I would like to start by explaining a bit of what is Apigee Analytics. So basically, it's a component in Apigee that collects and calculates a vast wealth of information that basically flows through your API proxies. And this contains either, for example, some processing latency, some sizes, some information on your cache details, on your traffic, on even monetization metrics that you might have, or even if you want some custom analytics. So there's a feature which is data capture, in which you can actually define some specific custom analytics you want to cover, and then you can just import them with data capture and define them. And then what is the big thing that Apigee Analytics brings to the table? Is basically you can visualize all this data that we just mentioned with graphs and charts via the Apigee UI. Or if you want, you can also download all this raw data that is very useful for offline analysis using the Apigee APIs. And that is exactly the process that we're going to be covering today in the presentation. Another important topic is that in order to actually use the Apigee Analytics, you must have the add-on enabled. And in subscriptions, this should be already enabled for you. For pay-as-you-go organizations, you must enable the add-on through the console or through the API, for example, in order to actually use this feature. Some other limitations that are important to know is that Apigee Analytics, for example, is not supported for versions of Apigee Hybrid below 1.13, just a good fact to know. And also that data on Apigee Analytics is available up to 14 months. If you want to store it, for example, for later, then you can use the process that we're going to be covering today. Also, you might ask yourself, so why wouldn't you just use the Apigee Analytics UI, for example? Why would you actually want to export this information into another destination? It can be through a multitude of reasons. So there are some use cases where you might want to perform complex querying, for example, that is not possible with the standard UI, with what it provides to you. You might want to also combine all these Apigee Analytics data with some other business data sources, for example. Or you might even want to do some deeper analysis. So you might want to run some machine learning to actually understand how your proxy behavior is impacting, for example, your sales or your other business use cases. And this might be useful for that. And for that, you might want to actually export this data into BigQuery, for example, to actually perform more complex analysis. On the other side, you might also just want to keep some historical analysis, for example, or just keep this to have a larger data retention period than just the 14 months. And in that case, you might want to actually export this data to just Google Cloud Storage, for example. Or if you have some auditing or compliance, for example, requisites, for example, you might also want to push this data into Google Cloud Storage. Those are the majority of use cases we actually see clients actually perform this process. So it's also good to know. Then if we go deeper on what this process actually implies, so there are only two possible export destinations, as I mentioned. So we have cloud storage and BigQuery. And the possible formats in which you can export the data are in CSV, in which you're going to have your information comma delimited, for example. By default, of course, you can choose other options. And you can also export the information in JSON format. And in this case, it will be new line delimited. But of course, you can select option. You have options here. You can configure them. And regarding permissions, which are also always very important, you do need to have two permissions to actually run this process. And in order to manage the data stores and actually run the analytics export batch jobs, you're going to have these two permissions that we see here on the screen, which is the Apigee Analytics Editor and the Apigee Org Administrator. Without these two, you won't be able to run the export jobs, basically. Another very important feature to know about this process is that the data export tasks actually run asynchronously in the background, and that in terms of pricing for each process that we're going to check for both cloud storage and BigQuery, you are charged for occupied storage and data processing, as well as possible costs, for example, associated with the add-on, of course, depending on your entitlement level here. And for those specific features, you can check more details on the documentation and through the GCP's pricing calculator, as usual. Now going more deeply into the process itself. So if we want to export the Apigee Analytics data to BigQuery, the first step that we need to do is actually configure the destination. And in this case, we're going to need to configure our BigQuery dataset. There are some restrictions here in the process where you choose BigQuery as a destination. So if you have configured your Apigee Analytics region to be either in a EU region or the US or US region, then you must configure your BigQuery dataset to be in the EU multi-region dataset, or and vice versa for the US multi-region dataset. However, there is a possibility that if for some restrictions that your organization has, if you need to specify a specific region for your BigQuery dataset, you can. However, the workaround implies using GCS as an intermediary to this process. A good thing to know here. Then, in terms of permissions again, because this is also always very important, you do need to ensure that your Apigee service agent service account has the required permissions to actually run the export. In this case, you're going to need the BigQuery job user and the BigQuery data editor. Again, as I mentioned, this is a batch-oriented process, not really in real time. You trigger the export job, and it's going to run the export to your selected destination. Then after you have the permissions and your destination configured, you actually need to create what we can see as the bridge between your Apigee Analytics and your destination, and that is the data store. The first step that is always recommended is actually to test your data store configuration, which is going to be your data repository. And basically, you test it just to ensure that you have all the proper permissions. So let's say that you forgot, for example, to give the Apigee service agent service account the BigQuery job user. If you test your data repository configuration, it's going to tell you you're missing a permission. So this is very useful just to ensure that when you actually run the analytics data job, it's not because you misconfigured your data store that it's going to fail, okay? So you actually first test the data store configuration, and then you create the data store. And as such, you basically ensure that everything is well set up for you actually to run the export job. After you have the data store created, which again, as I mentioned, is the kind of a bridge between Apigee Analytics and your chosen destination. Also important to know in the data store, to mention, in the data store is where you're going to configure, for example, what is going to be your location, your destination, in this case BigQuery, but also in which data set you want data to be stored. What is the prefix for the tables that are going to be created, and so on. Finally, as the last step, once everything is done above, you can actually run the analytics export job. And as mentioned, this runs asynchronously in the background. You just trigger the process to run. And then once it's finished, you're going to be able to see the information in your chosen location. As mentioned before, you do need to have the organization administrator to actually use the API that runs the export analytics. There are some restrictions as well, which is the data range can only span 1 day. So you can run the export for a specific day. If you want to have the information for multiple days, for example, you will need to run several times this API. And since this can be quite expensive because you're basically collecting all the Apigee analytics for 1 day on your organization, and this can become expensive fast, Apigee does enforce a quota of 15 calls per day per organization on calls to this API, just to avoid you having sudden spikes in costs because of using this API. For the GCS part, it's more or less the same. You don't really have the restriction that we mentioned regarding regions for the creation of the GCS bucket here. However, there is another restriction. So when you're doing the GCS exports, actually underneath the hood, Apigee is using the BigQuery API to leverage BigQuery export features in order to export the information to cloud storage. So because of that, you need to ensure that the BigQuery API is actually enabled on the GCP project. And again, you need to ensure you have the proper permissions. And this concerns, again, having the BigQuery job user. And in order to write to Google Cloud Storage, the storage admin permission as well. Just one important thing here to note is that if these roles are, for example, too broad for your organization, you can also create a custom role and simply just add the required permissions that are needed for the export job. So you don't need to use these such broad roles. You can actually create your own custom ones with just the permissions that the export jobs require. The remaining of the process is basically the same. So again, you're going to have to test your data repository configuration just to ensure everything is set up properly, create the data store, and then run the analytics data job whenever you need. One also important thing to note here is if you want to, for example, automate this process, because you might not want to run this, of course, manually every time you need the information, you can actually set up, for example, a scheduler with a combination of a Cloud Function or a Cloud Run script to actually do this process for you. There are many ways to do this, but just know there is the possibility to actually automate this. We will not be covering this here. We're just going to show how you can do this, but there's always the possibility of automating this process. And finally, one good thing to mention about here, it's a joint integration between Apigee Analytics and Looker integration, is that if you want to view your Apigee Analytics and monetization data, for example, you can see it in the Apigee UI. However, if you want, you can actually leverage the power of Looker Studio integrations and connect your Apigee data to their templates, for example, because Looker Studio is a very powerful and flexible tool where you can display data in fully customizable dashboards and reports. So if you want, you can either leverage the default templates that Looker integration already makes available to you, in which you can integrate your own Apigee data, or you can even create your own reports with the configurations that you want, and you can actually see very interesting data about your proxies, for example. However, in order to do this integration, you must have the role Apigee Analytics Editor in order to be able to make the connection of your data source, which in this case is Apigee, to Looker Studio, and then being able to display your information there. This is the process to export the Apigee Analytics information to the two destinations we just mentioned. Now, let's see the other portion of what logging can be in Apigee, because you might not necessarily just want Apigee Analytics. Your organization might have defined your own proxy, a custom proxy strategy, for example. So let's say that your organization has defined a specific log structure, and they are producing, all their proxies are producing logs and are emitting them to cloud logging, let's say. And let's say you want to keep this information not just in cloud logging, you actually want to analyze it further, either in BigQuery for the reasons we mentioned before, because you want to do more complex querying, you want to deep dive, you want to further understand your data, and you can. And alternatively, you just want to archive the data and keep it just for storage, let's say auditing or compliance or just historical record keeping, for example. And in that case, you can also do it with GCS. Those are the two ways we're going to cover now. One important introduction here as well is that, so for those who do not know, cloud logging is basically, let's call it the central nervous system for all that are logs in Google Cloud Storage. And Google Cloud Logging actually makes available what we call log sinks. And log sinks are basically an export mechanism that you have in which basically you can define that certain logs, certain specific logs that you define through filters, either inclusion or exclusion filters. You define those filters, and then you just say all of these logs that abide by this specific rule, I want to route them to a specific destination. And so in this way, log sinks basically are a configuration that defines how you route your logs, your specific logs, to a destination that you wish for. In this case, we're going to be covering BigQuery and Google Cloud Storage. Another important feature here is that these log sinks, they route logs basically in near real time as they arrive in cloud logging. However, they only do so from the moment they are created. So once you create a log sink, all this information is gonna start flooding into your chosen destination. However, if you want to keep as well previous data, for example, in that case, you're gonna have to do something like a one-shot ingestion to actually feed this information to the same destination as well, okay? You can create and manage these log sinks through the Google Cloud Console, the Cloud Logging API, and even the Google Cloud CLI. And the log ingestion that we're discussing here is usually charged for log buckets. However, for log routing, so these log sinks, you're not necessarily charged for creating the log sink. You are, however, charged for all the costs that are implied with the, for example, storage space used by the log destination and so on. So not per the log sink, but for the destination that you have selected and costs associated with it. Then deep diving a bit on what can be your custom logging strategy. So usually in Apigee, we have a specific phase where usually you emit logs to the desired system that you want. So usually this process is done in the post-client flow. And why? Because this is a recommended flow, because any code that is executed at this phase is actually executing after the client has already received the proxy response. And this means that you're not, by emitting these logs, you are not impacting your latencies, your response latencies. However, some of the policies that are allowed at this step are quite limited. So for example, we do have message logging and service callouts, for example, as well as many others, for example, flow callouts, but they are a restricted set of policies allowed here. So for the logging part, which we are discussing today, the message logging is quite useful because it's a standard policy that basically allows you to log a custom message to cloud logging, for example. And you can actually afterwards, you can use this information of your logs in various ways. For example, for tracking down problems in the environment, for, let's say, raising alerts based on certain conditions, for example, and that's at a later stage. But for that, you do need to output your own custom logs if you require that. Alternatively, you also have the service callout policy, which lets you call external services via API calls, for example. And for that, you can, for example, call the Cloud Logging API to actually also push logs to Cloud Logging. And usually service callout is a bit more flexible in the sense that, for example, one message logging will produce you one log to Cloud Logging. But let's say on one proxy call, you actually want to output several logs, for example. because let's say you want to create a log at each phase of, for example, of your proxy. In that case, you might use service callout because it allows you to output multiple logs with just one policy call, for example. It is important to note, however, that both of these policies are extensible, and as such, their use might have costs or implications, of course, depending on your Apigee license. And another important factor to know is, as mentioned, this post-client flow phase, you cannot use all the policies that Apigee makes available. So if we're thinking, for example, assign message policies, extract variable policies, which actually allow you to change variables and manipulate your request and response, they are not allowed at this phase. So let's say that you want to configure your log body, for example, the payload that you want to send to cloud logging, you usually will do this at previous phases. So in message logging, Service Cloud, for example, you can build the outer structure for your logging, but all the variables that are used to do that should be configured at earlier stages. Something important to note. Then going back to log syncs, just to do a quick run around, we do have multiple destinations that are supported. You can route your logs to another GCP project, for example. You can route them to log buckets or even pub subtopics. We will not be covering those in this session because we're just going to deep dive into the BigQuery datasets destination and cloud storage destination. But it's good to know that we have that possibility. And ideally, for example, for BigQuery, you're going to use usually this export if you, as I mentioned before, you want to join this custom proxy log data that you're producing with some other business data to, for example, gain further insights. However, you do need to pay attention that your BigQuery data set that you select as your destination, it needs to be write-enabled. So you cannot use, for example, linked data sets since they are only read-only, for example. And one good thing to note here is that you can configure your exports table to actually be, for example, partitioned per date, which we're going to check on our demo afterwards. For GCS, again, as mentioned before, it's ideal for long-term storage, as you're aware. It's a very good component for that. However, it does have a particularity that the BigQuery dataset doesn't have, which is basically, so once you activate the BigQuery log sync, it's going to automatically start picking up all the log data that is coming into your cloud logging component and routing it to the destination. For cloud storage bucket, it's not really the case. So what happens is that all the logging entries that are being caught by the filter will be processed, but only hourly. So after the hour passes, if there have been logs produced on that specific hour, then they will be pushed to cloud storage in a JSON file, for example. If, for example, there has been no traffic or no log being created for that specific filter of your log sync, then you will not see a file created for that. So it's normal that you see more of a sporadic flow, and in BigQuery, you are going to see a continuous flow very likely. Some restrictions here regarding log syncs, which I think is always important to note, is that there are some limitations, some quotas. You can create, for example, 200 syncs for a Google Cloud project. You cannot create more. And for example, for the filters, you have quite versatile filters. They are basically in the same language that cloud logging interacts with. So you can define a vast amount of filters. However, they cannot exceed in the log syncs the 2,000 characters, and you cannot create more than 50 exclusion filters. So you have one inclusion filter, which can be quite extensive. For the exclusions, you can go up to 50, no more per sync. And finally, one very important permission in order to be able to actually create the syncs is that you need to be to have the role logs configuration writer at least in order to be able to create the sync. Going now into the actual process again. So the first step is actually having your proxy producing custom logs. And this, as we've seen previously, can be done with message logging or a service callout, for example. Then you need to deploy your proxy, ideally with a dedicated service account that has the log writer permission, in this case, in order to be able to push to cloud logging to the cloud logging component. And then you need to create a data set in BigQuery to store the logs. Then, as the final step, you're actually going to create your log sync, in this case, pointing to BigQuery. And here you need to configure a bunch of stuff. So you need to configure the filters, as we mentioned, so both the inclusion and exclusion filters. And one good thing about the log syncs is that actually, as you're developing your filter, you can actually preview the logs in the creation menu of the log sync. So you can see, as you change the filter, what is actually going to be catching, or what is catching currently, for example, based on that specific filter. And finally, you also need to ensure that the syncs identity, which is the writer identity, which you can see in the log syncs details, for example, that it has the BigQuery data editor permission. okay? Just so the sink is able to actually push the data to BigQuery in this case. And as the last step, you just basically, once you create the sink, the logs are going to start flowing. So you need to give it a few seconds just to actually be created. And once that is done, you're going to be seeing in near real time the logs actually flowing into your location. And in this case, it's going to be your BigQuery data set in a specific table, which you've configured the name when you've created the log sink, for example. For GCS, the process is very similar. So you just, again, need to ensure that your proxy is producing logs, that it has been deployed with the dedicated service account log writer permissions, that you have created the bucket in cloud storage to store your logs, and that your filters are catching whatever kind of logs you want to actually be catching. With, again, the permission, but in this case, instead of being the BigQuery permission, you actually are going to require the storage data editor permission. And the difference with the BigQuery process is that the files are going to be created in GCS, but they're going to be created hourly, and they're going to be created as JSON files in your GCS location. And now I would like to show you a demo for both of these processes that we've just discussed. So I'm going to quickly share my screen over here. Hopefully it's not too small for you to see. So I've prepared here a few scripts basically to just go over this. So because all of the process of exporting Apigee Analytics information is done through an API. And basically you can configure a script, as I mentioned before, a Cloud Run or a Cloud Function, for example, API, to just actually run this process for you. So in this case, I'm just going to go here to my location. I'm going to first show you how, for example, the test data store call, for example, it works. And for that, I'm actually going to delete one of the data stores that I've already had created before. So I'm going to delete my GCS data store, first of all. And basically what I want to show you guys is that if I have already the data store created, for example, what's going to happen is it's going to output me 429, just saying you've already created that, for example. So in this case, just let me check here. Oh, I think the credentials didn't work. Just give me a second. I'm going to reconfigure this. But basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete the data store. Once the data store for the GCS is deleted, I'm actually going to test it. And basically what we're going to be able to see is we're going to be able to see that it's going to say success because you have all the permissions. You just don't have the data store created, for example. And if we test the BigQuery data set, then what is going to happen is basically it's just going to say you already created that data store. So you don't need to, basically you're not going to be able to do anything. And that's basically what we're going to be able to see once this finally finishes loading. Let's give it just a second. And I'll show you the script running. So first of all, we're going to run the cleanup. Just give it a moment to run. So we've deleted the data store. This just basically means it has successfully deleted it. And it deletes it based on the data store ID, which I basically collected before. So now if we actually, so I have also a script for actually just getting the data stores, which is basically just fetching all the data store configurations I have in this project, for example. And if I now run it, I will only see a data store created for BigQuery. And here we can see, so this is his ID, for example. This is the project we're working on. This is the display name, for example. The target type, the destination is BigQuery, for example. And we see all this nice information about it. So the project where the data set is, the BigQuery data set, for example, the table prefix. So every time I run an export job, the table that's going to be created in the data set will have this prefix, for example. And for cloud storage destination, the information is just slightly different, but it's more or less the same. So we validated that the GCS data store has been deleted. Now we're going to test it. So the test is actually running. I can show you the difference. So the test is actually the exact same call as you would do to create a data store, for example, with the only difference that you add this suffix just saying test. So you're basically running the same command, but instead of actually creating the data store, it's just checking that you have everything you need to actually run the process. And so that's what we're doing here. So for the first one, which is the GCS data store, we see that it's saying state completed. If by any chance you were missing a permission, you would not see this kind of JSON structure in the output. You would actually see an error structure stating what permission you are missing, for example. So in this case, we already have all the permissions. And for the BigQuery data store, we already see that it exists, so there's nothing to be done. So now what we're going to do is basically just create the GCS data store again. So I'm going to run very quickly this script just to create our GCS data store. Here we can see the configuration is slightly different. So you mentioned the target type as GCS, for example. You mentioned the project ID to which you want, to where your bucket, for example, is. You mentioned the bucket name, and then the path is basically the folder. So basically the location in your bucket where you want to store the information, which in this case, we've selected here a folder name, which is basically the analytics logs. So when we go check the output for our export job, we should be able to see the files being created in the analytics logs folder in this case. So we can see here that our data store has been created successfully with the configurations we just provided on our script. And now we're just going to quickly do a get just to ensure that everything was set up properly. We can see that we have two now. So we have our BigQuery data store still. And now we also have the GCS data store. And basically, these just function as bridges between Apigee Analytics and then our destined location, which in this case, either GCS or BigQuery. And now finally, what we can do is we can also confirm what kind of analytics jobs are running at the moment, because we can check the status for that. In this case, there won't be any running because we didn't request any right now. We can see that some have been run, for example, for yesterday, for example, for the same configurations. Some were run today, for example, in the morning, because I did a quick test in the morning and so on. But basically, we don't see any running. And we can see the most recent ones here through this API. I can quickly show as well. Basically, we're just fetching all of the analytics exports that have been run. Now, if we actually want to run an execution, for example, we also have here the configuration. Important to note again that the date range that you mentioned, in the start, you're going to put the date, and in the end, you're going to put the next day, for example, because your export job can only actually span the information for 1 day. In this case, the analytics job that we're running is going to basically be for yesterday, because we ran some calls yesterday. However, the calls that we have run today, for example, they won't appear in our export job. Okay. And you can also define the output, for example, if you want CSV or JSON. I believe in this one we have CSV exactly. And we can also define the data store name. So basically, what is going to be our bridge to actually run the analytics job. So now, if we actually run our export analytics, this is actually very fast because, again, we have little requests in this project. If you had multiple ones, this could take a bit just to finish running. So now I should be able to see that we see here all the completed ones. Hopefully I was fast enough. Exactly. We see one here running for our cloud storage, for example. And we also see here the one for BigQuery. So we see both of them running. And in this case, if we wanted to find, for example, if we wanted to get a specific report for our specific analytics job, we could do so based on this ID. So we could fetch this ID, and instead of doing a general get to the Export Analytics API, we could actually just go fetch the status for the specific one we just ran. So now basically what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to do the get again, just to ensure that the process has finished. Here we can see that they've all completed. Again, we have little requests here. And now what I want to see is I'm just very quickly going to show you. So I've already run here in the logging component. I've already run a filter to just get me all the requests that were run yesterday. We can see that we have around 104 Apigee results. So here I'm just fetching the logs that came from Apigee. In this case, we can see we have 104. And now if I want to, for example, let's go here to BigQuery to actually see if the export worked and if we have our data in the data set we have defined. Now, if we quickly go to our data set, we should be able to see a new table has been created. And here it's important to note that it's going to be created with the prefix that we have defined, which I believe it's Apigee, and I think it's a hyphen and a val. And we should be able to now see the table since the two analytics jobs already finished. So if we go here to our data set, for example, once it loads, we're going to be able to see two tables. One of the tables we're going to ignore because it's the second part. But this one, so the Apigee's hyphen eval, which is the one that was just created, you see that the prefix is what we have defined in our data store, for example. So it was based on our configurations on the connection. And the remaining information is basically metadata. So stating basically what is the date span that you're covering on your export. And then if we deep dive into the actual table to see what kind of information was exported, we can see that all of these fields that we see here are basically metrics and dimensions that are covered by the Apigee Analytics. So all of the information that you have, for example, that you have in Apigee Analytics in the UI, you can actually see it defined here as well. So it's quite nice if you just want to export and do some play around with the information and join it with some other information. Then if we go to preview, we can actually see all this data with the actual calls information. So in this case, the calls were very similar. They were all to the same proxy. We can see here that the response status, for example, for some was 401, 200s, and so on. We can see the timestamps in which the data was sent. And basically, this is all predefined and default metrics that Apigee Analytics already provides to you. So it's quite nice information. Some metrics, for example, here weren't defined, which is why we don't see the information for those. But as long as you define them and it's caught by the Apigee Analytics, it should come into your export as well. So it's very good to know. So we checked BigQuery. Now, if we want to, for example, just come check here in our cloud storage, we can. So in here, we're also going to ignore this one. This is the second part of the demo. We have defined that our location, as we saw before, we decided that our location was going to be the analytics logs folder. So here, same thing is going to happen. In here, we didn't define a prefix. We just defined the location. So what the information you see here was basically what was appended to the prefix in BigQuery. It's the same data. And then if we go to this specific folder, for example, we can see the file. And this file is just basically going to be a JSON file, a CSV, because we defined on our data store a CSV. And it's basically going to contain the same information we just saw in BigQuery, but here in cloud storage. And then in cloud storage, you can define whatever data retention you want, versions if it's necessary, and so on. And you can just use it, for example, for archival if you want. And regarding data stores and the analytics export, that's basically it. Another thing I would like to very quickly show you is how you can integrate these with Looker. So if you want to integrate your analytics, your Apigee Analytics information in Looker Studio, you can actually do so super easily. So if we jump here to Looker Studio, we do have a section here which is templates. And GCP basically already makes available for you some specific Apigee templates, which you can use as you wish. And basically, these are just templates, which then, if you want, you can create your own version of them. In this case, in this project, I'm not going to show the monetization because I don't have monetization configured in this project. However, I can show you the analytics one. So I'm going to quickly go here to the template. And basically, Looker Studio is going to open for me the template in which then I can configure to use, for example, my own data. And in this case, what am I doing? I'm basically just saying, OK, link my Apigee data through the organization, the Apigee organization, and just push this data to all of these graphics that you have here. And then basically what I'm able to see, it's all those nice metrics from Apigee Analytics, but in this template, which if I want, I can then change the template and add graphics as I wish based on the metrics that Analytics provides. In this case, the filter is not pointing to the right time, so I'm just very quickly going to change this for the month of September, just so we can quickly see some data here. So already we can see some information about our organization. Again, this is a very small organization. As you can see here, we can see the number of developers, the number of apps and products. We can also see the traffic, so how many requests you've been receiving per app. Again, you can select here and see it per specific one. Here we see some requests were not associated, for example, with an app. So we see here not set, for example. And basically, you can see all this nice information with the advantage that on the Apigee Analytics UI, you cannot change the UI. But here on your templates, you can basically just edit this template. So you can start from a very nice template and just edit, put whatever graphic information you want based on the metrics, and then you can share it, for example, with your team or relevant stakeholders. So it's a very useful feature and very important to note. Then this was the export process to Apigee Analytics. Now I also wanted to show for the custom proxy logs. And I'm going to try to do this quickly so we have time for some questions. So basically on this project, I created a very small proxy, a very simple one. It has a very basic authentication. And then basically at the end, it's just either out, depending on the path suffix that I call upon, it's basically either going to output the log data through a message logging to the cloud logging component, or it's going to run it through a service call out again to the cloud logging API. And a funny thing I wanted to showcase here is basically with the log syncs, whatever is the structure that you define here, which can be different depending on the proxy that you are configuring it, what's going to happen is both BigQuery and GCS are basically when the log sync fetches the log, it's going to output the information exactly as it is. So let's say that the same log sync is catching very different kinds of logs. All the different fields, which might not be the same, for example, might have different ones depending on the proxy outputting the logs. They're all going to be automatically caught by the sync, and they're going to be outputted to the destination. So you don't need here to be concerned about, for example, schemas and so on. Okay. Very good thing to know. And yeah, so one thing is important to notice here, because I will use this for the log sync, which is why I wanted to show here. In order just to make this a very simple demo, I've defined the field called log type with the value API log, for example. And basically what I had my log syncs do is basically just catch this field. And if this field has this specific value, then I want to catch all of these and just output it to the destinations I've defined, just to make our lives easier. And same thing on the service callouts. So again, you see it's the way you configure the production of the construction of the log is slightly different, but you can still configure the same variables in order to be caught by the log router in this case. But again, different ways to do the same thing, but they all work mostly. So now, if we go to our log router, basically, I've previously configured this because, again, as I've mentioned, if I just created the log syncs now, what was going to happen is we wouldn't be able to see logs, because for the BigQuery dataset, it's in near real time. So it would take a few seconds just to configure it, and then I would need to do some calls and they would appear. But for the cloud storage bucket, this is done hourly. So I had to set up this previously, simply input some traffic on the proxies in order for us to actually be able to see a few things. So now I'm going to go back to our BigQuery. And basically, this is where it comes in this table, the second table. And this table, basically, what we are going to be able to see, if we could simulate some traffic now, but I see we're running out of time, so maybe I won't do that right now. But we can see that all of this structure is basically the default logging structure of the cloud logging component. However, on the JSON payload, for example, you can configure as many fields as you want. And this is where your custom logging strategy enters. So as many fields as you define in your logs and that are being produced to cloud logging, they will be added here to the table. So for example, if we come here to the preview, oh, sorry, that's not what I wanted to do. Sorry, let's just go back. And while this loads, maybe I will show the cloud storage. Yeah, I'm going to show the cloud storage. So same thing for the cloud storage. I ran this previously because of the hour issue I just mentioned. Over here, I already ran some traffic again for yesterday and today, just so we could see some stuff. So what we're going to be able to see here is, depending on the configuration that we did, we're going to be able to see here traffic according to, we're going to see files being created, like JSON files, as I've mentioned, for the hours in which we had traffic running, for example. So in this case, we see we had traffic in these 2 hours. In the remaining ones, we didn't have traffic, and that's why we don't see the information. And again, this JSON file that you're going to be able to see here once we open it is basically just going to be the structure, the logging structure that you have defined here. So basically, once you open that JSON, you're just going to see this structure with all the logs for all the requests your proxy has processed. And of course, here you're going to be able to see it for yesterday in the times I ran, and for today as well, because I ran a few tests in the morning, for example. So you're able to see this. If I ran right now, for example, you would only see it after 5, for example. Okay. So we would need to wait until the end of the presentation to actually see data, which is why I'm not going to demo that part. Coming back here to our BigQuery. Let's just wait for this to load. And then we can see the table, which is basically going to see the same thing. So we're going to actually see the data, but in a tabular format, of course. And we're going to be able to see all the records that have been pushed since yesterday, in this case. So once we open this table, again, the structure will be flexible according to your logs. So it's not the same as the analytics export, in which you have a very well-defined structure, which is the structure Apigee Analytics defines. In here, you're actually going to have your custom structure. So if we now go here to the preview, and we can search here a bit for information, we're going to be able to see, for example, that some fields are filled for some, for example, requests, and others aren't. And that is because for some, we configured a few values, and for others not. So for example, for the logs being produced by the service callout policy, in this case, which was a different path of the proxy, we've configured the message field in the JSON payload. However, for the message logging path, we didn't. And that's why you see here discrepancy in schemas. However, the good thing about this is basically you can cover all kinds of structures just with this. for example, and automatically picks up the schema for your logs, and you have an updated table with all this information. And another cool thing about it is you can define your table to be partitioned, for example. So if we go here to the details, we can see, for example, this table is partitioned per day. And so if you want to check specific data for specific days, you can actually run the queries through the partition and just select the specific days you want to get information on. And with that, I think we finished the presentation. I think there are some questions. I saw them pop up. So.
Awesome, Sophia. This was a great presentation. We do have quite a few questions. So, but before we jump into that, thank you for this presentation. I'll read your questions out loud, everyone. And if you like, you can open your mic and compliment anything you would like to add. We got the first one, and sorry about the pronunciation of some of your names. Please correct me so I can learn how to properly pronounce your names. Thank you. We have the first one from Mahindra. So 14 months is the retention period. And I guess this question was at the very beginning of your presentation. Anything you would like to complement to the question, Mahindra? Okay, I don't hear back, but yeah, the question was 14 months, is 14 months the retention period?
Sorry, yeah, sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, basically Apigee Analytics, once you activate it, it will store data up to 14 months. And after that period has passed, it will basically continue. So it's kind of a sliding window. So the previous records of Apigee Analytics, you won't be able to get. So if you want to keep that information, the recommended process in this case is to export this data, if it's just for archival, to GCS, for example, to a bucket, as we've shown here in this presentation, or if you want to do more analytics and actually interact with the data and join it with other data sources that you have that could potentiate some very interesting findings between your data sources, then you would push the data to BigQuery. But yeah, that's a quota well defined in the documentation. Yeah. Sorry, Alex, I think now you're on mute.
It happens to all of us. We have a question from John Mark. Does that mean that GCS export from Apigee Analytics is done through BigQuery API?
Yeah. Underneath the hood, the BigQuery API is running, and that's why you need the BigQuery permissions and the API enabled. Yeah, because it's leveraging the export capabilities of BigQuery to actually do the export. So yeah.
Thank you, Sophia. One from Muhammad Abid. Sophia, these are two scroll calls in sequence. Can we also have the Terraform version of the same? If available, please share it. And that will be very helpful.
For now, the only way to actually do the exports process I just mentioned is through the API calls. However, I can check up on my site if there are plans to actually have this possibility with Terraform. But for now, it's not available, just through the APIs that I mentioned.
Great, thanks. Another question from William Adams. How about capturing transaction logs? I have always have to write some custom share flow and injection in between policy steps. I would like to see the policies if they are shared anywhere. Thanks.
You mean the policies on the proxy that I showcased in the session, the demo? Because that one I can definitely share. I don't know if that was the question.
Yeah, that one would be great. And also like transaction logs as you're going through the message flow of your API proxy. Like, is it possible to capture logs at each step? Previously, I've had to like inject like a shared flow in between each policy step so it captures the logs, if that makes sense.
Yeah, usually the right approach or the way you can do it is just to build up your log information throughout the process, as you just mentioned. And so let's say you want to have the transaction log, for example, once you receive the information at the, let's say, the pre-proxy flow hook, which you can leverage the hooks to actually build this logging information. If you don't want to specifically have shared flows or specific policies, meanwhile, in between your proxy, for example, since you want to have a more standardized approach to it, you can leverage flow hooks to do that, although it implies using shared flows, as you just mentioned. And then at the end, in the post-client flow, you basically just output all those log variables that you have been building. But that's usually the approach that we see most people using. And it's the simplest, because in that way you can standardize the process for all proxies. I don't know if that answered your question, but.
Yeah, I don't want to take up too much time here. Thanks. Appreciate it, though.
Okay, but if you want, you can ping me a message and maybe we can deep dive a bit more on the exact struggle that you're facing and we can follow up on it.
Awesome. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Feel free. Yeah, of course.
Thank you both. We've got another question from Jean-Marc. Is it possible to select fields to export from Apigee Analytics to BigQuery, or only all fields? Okay, never mind. I think I read this one already.
Yeah, but that's a great question. I don't know if I replied already, but honestly, you need to do the whole export. It would be interesting to maybe be able to just select what specific fields you want. I will take that point. That might be interesting, but for now, you need to do the whole export of all the analytics. Yeah.
Thanks. One from Anil. Is Looker Studio included in the Apigee Enterprise subscription, or does it require any additional subscription?
For the use of the integration with the Looker Studio that I just showcased, it's actually free, so you can use it. I do believe it's integrated in the enterprise one, but for more complex features, I'm not an expert on here the licensing issues, but I can check on my side, and we are planning to actually create, based on this presentation that you saw today and on your questions, we do want to create maybe an article in order to be able to structurate all this information a bit better. And I can definitely include some mentions to the licensing part for Looker Studio as well. I'd be happy to.
Looking forward to get that content shared with you guys. Now, we've got another one from Rafael. Apigee PDK, is there any option available to export analytics data and logs?
With this process on Apigee Analytics, right? Yeah, for hybrid and APGX, I do know there is no issue. You can use it perfectly. For Apigee OPDK, I'm actually not sure. I can check it on my side. Maybe you can ask some more questions, and I will check it on my side.
Yeah, Rafael, even if you want to, you can open a thread in the Apigee forum, and we can follow up there with you.
Yeah, and either way, I will take that note to add it to the article as well.
Great.
So that is good to know.
Amazing, Sophia. Second to last question from John again. Is the way you're exporting logs the same for Apigee X and Apigee Hybrid?
And here you mentioned, you mean the custom proxy logs or the Apigee Analytics ones?
The analytics one is.
The analytics one, it's the same process, basically.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Great.
For the custom logs, just to give a quick note, it's important. For the custom logs parts that I shared, it's mostly to APGX, because if you're not pushing your Apigee hybrid logs to cloud logging, then it won't work, the process I showcased, just to give that note.
Thank you, Sophia. Last question from the chat from Mohammed. Can we have the sample project you to showcase in the demo?
I will check it internally how we can add it, either in the article or maybe in some other GitHub location. Maybe then, Alex, I can share it through you, maybe with the rest of the community. But yeah, we can definitely share it. Yeah.
All righty. So that was it for questions, everyone. Do you still have some more questions? Feel free to raise your hand and open your mic. This is a space for you to keep on learning alongside with us. And while we wait for you to share more questions in case you have some, thank you. Big thank you, Sophia, for this great presentation. I love having you on this stage. I don't see any more hands raised or questions in the Q&A or in the chat. So I guess we can start wrapping up the session for today. Let me just go ahead and open the poll. I'm gonna send you guys a poll here in the meeting so you can share your feedback with us. It's always really valuable that we can get this input from your end to know whether you like the session, what you would like to see in upcoming presentations that we give to you. So thank you everyone for taking a second to share your feedback. Just gotta check on the purple icon at the top right corner of the meeting and share your vote in there. With that, I'm gonna leave this QR for you to go and check out our Apigee and Integration Services community spaces. I wanna take a bit of a moment to show you why you can take a look at these spaces. Apigee and Integration Services communities have evolved from just a standalone forum to now become an entire sub-community where you can find all the articles that we can share with you in the Knowledge Hub. Feel free to look at all of these resources. You should be able to share some comments and questions to follow up on the threads of these articles and curated content that the Googlers have prepared for you. You can also catch up on upcoming events. We have quite a few coming all the way to North America, Latin America, and in our EMEA region. So we look forward to seeing you at these events. And last but not least, catch up on the news and announcements that mostly the product management team is sharing with you. Meg and Bruce product manager from Apigee specializing on security, has just shared with us a release rundown from the latest release notes on Apigee. Just gonna drop the link in the chat for you guys to go and take a look. And the same applies for integration services community space for app integration questions related. We just have an extra section for you to go and take a look at our on-demand videos in there so you can enable yourself and learn how to use app integration and the integration connectors. With that, I'm going to hand it back to you, Sophia, to walk us through these resources that you are going to be leaving behind for the community.
Of course, yeah. I've felt the need to just add all the interesting links that I found regarding this subject, just in order for you to be able to deep dive further if you want on the topic. Of course, we're going to make available the assets that we've shown today and so on, but it's always good if you want more information to actually go through the documentation and see all the restrictions, the possibilities that we might, some of them might not have been mentioned here. So I've divided the assets through basically sections. So we start with the Apigee Analytics. We have here, I mentioned the limitations, which some of them I covered in the session, but there are more limitations. So it's always good to know the quotas and so on. So I've added documentation here. I added some generic documentation on the export process that I went through right now. And then here you can find some information on actually how to integrate Apigee Analytics with Looker Studio, for example. So you have here some very interesting links, either from the documentation or from the community. I always suggest people to go through the community posts. They have a lot of information, very useful. And sometimes some of the issues that people come across, someone in the community has already posted them to the Googlers. So it's very good to actually go and check the community as well. And yeah, and also for the custom logs, if you go lower, Alex, please, you have some more assets as well on the custom proxy and how you can go about it. Oh yeah, I do have here some more Looker Studio URLs you can check regarding the templates, which I've showed you. We have the monetization and the analytics one, and then some reflections here on the IAM with Looker Studio as well. And finally, with the log syncs, so because there are some other supported destinations that we didn't mention in this session, so I thought it was important to include those as well. So I do mention here, and we do have two very interesting sessions about the log syncs, routing, and so on, and the alerting based on logs. So I've also added the links here to some YouTube videos you can check out, which I think are very good to get a good overview if you want to look beyond what we discussed today. And I believe I might have another page with links. Yeah, and this one is focused on the alerting, because sometimes there appear some questions if the approaches we discussed today are also related to monitoring. They can be, but the main focus that's covered on these two approaches is actually getting more insights of your proxy data. So not necessarily alerting. For alerting, you do have the possibility of actually define log-based alerts, and that's what I also wanted to put here in case that's one of the questions that come up later. So I also added here some documentation, and I believe that was it. Thank you so much, Alex.
Thank you so much, Sophia. So everyone, we look forward to seeing you on our next section on September the 18th on Apigee Cogen. Again, thank you so much, Sophia, for joining us. I'll make sure I'll share the recording through the community. And yeah, everyone, thank you for joining us. We'll see you soon.